distance of time where Teamsters have not had to serve their country in a military capacity. So we try to find other ways to serve the nation. And one of the first ways we do that is in 1906, when the earthquake hits in San Francisco. Mike Casey, who's the founder of Local 85, immediately jumps in and starts doing rescue and removal of rubble with his members. He coordinates this with the National Guard that has been sent out to work on this issue. And that is how Teamsters become first responders, and that's how we serve the military until that first conflict comes about. But I do want to note that in 1943 a ship was named after Mike Casey for all of his contributions, not only to the labor movement, but to the nation for his work with the earthquake and work that followed afterwards. Here you see there is a Liberty ship that is the SS Michael Casey. The other picture is the dedication for the ship as they put it into the water. So for a person from the labor movement to actually have a ship named after them for the way that they serve the nation is a pretty big deal. Now we come to World War I, and again, as I said, this is the first major conflict that the Teamsters as a union face with the nation. Now, some of our young, very progressive members, when the union is founded in 1903, like Tom Hughes and Dan Tobin, are now more mature men. They are not young enough to be part of the initial draft, but they do serve the nation during the war years in other capacities. First of all, they do register for the draft. Men were asked to register for the draft up to an older age. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So Tom Hughes does that. Dan Tobin, interestingly, is asked by President Roosevelt to go overseas and do some work with the war production overseas, kind of see what's going on, get a feel for what's going to happen if we choose to participate in the war. But the first thing Dan has to do, he can't register for the draft because he's not a U.S. citizen. He came over at the age of 12 from Ireland and apparently was never required to become a citizen. But in 1917, in order to do war work, he is required to become a citizen. So he does. And he does go overseas for President Wilson to take care of war issues. John Gillespie is another one who registers both for World War I and World War II. One of the interesting things about John Gillespie was that in both of those conflicts, he really steps up and does all kinds of home front war efforts. He was too old to serve, but desperately wanted to make sure that he was able to play his role in those conflicts. So he was not a veteran, but he does serve the nation. Now, one leader that was a veteran was John English. His career is going very well. He's a driver. He's moving up to being business agent, officer in his local, and then World War I hits. He chooses to sign up before the draft and go into service. He does very well in the military. He earns the rank of sergeant very quickly, and he is encouraged to stay in the military to make it a career. But John English loves being in the Teamsters. He joined the Teamsters when he was almost 14 years old, so just barely a teenager, driving a coal wagon. He loved what he did, and he felt his best way to serve the nation was to continue in that vein. So after the war is over, he does return, and you can see the picture there. I've got him circled a little bit. Just those few years in the war really turned him from a very youthful looking young man into a much older, mature looking man. He's only about 28 years old in the picture where he's circled, but you can see that the war has taken quite a toll on him, as it did many of the veterans that returned home. Now, just so you kind of have an idea of what was going on with the draft, when the conflict of World War I begins, the first draft called for anyone who was 18 years old after June of 1917. It quickly then switches to anyone who is 18 by 21 by June of 1918. And then the final is that all men from age 21 to 45 years of age are required to register for the draft. Now that's World War I. As we move into World War II, it changes significantly. Men are required to register from age 18 to age 64. But the actual drafted men are in the categories of 18 to 45. But they potentially can call men up to 64 years of age. And in that conflict, the German army did call many, many older men into service who were in their 60s. They also called young boys into service who were in military schools. So some of the soldiers by the end of the war fighting for Germany were 13 years old, or they could be as old as 68 years old. Korea, again, the registration for the draft changes. Men from 18 and a half years old to 35 years old are required to register for a 2-year duty service. Now, men who served in World War II do not have to register for this selective service. And then we move into Vietnam. The Vietnam conflict calls for men 18 to 26 years old are eligible to be drafted. Now, later during the war, a lottery system is implemented where numbers were called up. So you could be 18 to 26 years old and not be called if your number did not come up in the draft. In 1973, conscription ends. Men from 18 to 26 are still required to register for a potential draft, but no one is being automatically called. After age 26, you cannot be called into war service. So that just gives you an idea of who was being called to serve during different conflicts. As we move into World War I, as the war is declared on April 6, 1917, America joins the war. Teamsters rushed to the colors and served overseas and on the home front. Many Teamsters immediately signed up for military service. But then an interesting thing happens. The United States Army comes to Dan Tobin, Blackjack Pershing, comes to Dan Tobin and asks, would the Teamsters participate in a program to teach soldiers how to drive? Motorized vehicles are a brand new thing as World War I breaks out. And many of the soldiers are infantry. They do not know how to drive these motorized vehicles, or they are cavalry. And so there is a lack of skill, not only in driving the vehicles, but coming up with a new sort of mechanized supply line that will help keep soldiers fed and whatnot on the front. So the Teamsters agree, yes, they will do this. So a large number of Teamsters go overseas or to military bases in the United States and serve as instructors in driving the vehicles, in how to fix the vehicles, and also how to be a motorized quartermaster system. Women also are called into service, not into the military, but they are called to step into the jobs that are vacated by the men. And here in this picture at the bottom, you see women are working on transferring a regular vehicle into a military vehicle. This vehicle that they're working on is actually the first four-wheel drive vehicle that had ever been designed. And the women are turning it into a military vehicle. And it had a very fancy name. The first four-wheel drive vehicle was actually called the first four-wheel drive vehicle. They weren't very creative in terms of how they named it. Here you can see Teamsters getting ready to go overseas and work on the supply lines. Pershing very much praised the Teamsters. We very quickly were able to get soldiers up to speed much faster than the Army had expected that we would be able to do so. So there was a lot of praise for what our members were doing in terms of helping to prepare America to fight overseas. As I said, women jumped into the fray, taking on all kinds of different jobs, all kinds of delivery work. You see here one of the jobs that was actually kind of scandalous was that women became conductors on the subway in New York City. And for some reason, that was just a step too far over the line for people to see women taking on that kind of authority role during the war. Now, women were able to deliver everything during the war except one thing. And that one thing was alcohol. It was considered immoral for women to deliver alcohol. So Dan Tobin says, okay, look, I'm a good Catholic. I get it. I go to Mass. But let me just explain to you, I don't have a lot of drivers here. So if women are not allowed to drive, there will be no beer delivery. So suddenly it's okay for women to deliver beer, and that's what the woman sitting on the top is doing. Women were also asked by the US government to step up and deliver medicine and doctors to the rural areas during the flu epidemic, which hit during World War I. And of course, Teamster women did step up to that cause and received commendations for the government. Now, one of the interesting things that happens with World War I is there's a lot of interest, both in World War I and later in World War II, about what women are wearing at work. What do their uniforms look like? Are they too revealing? Are they too tight? But what they don't pay attention to is safety issues. Women were doing very dangerous jobs, and there was very little regard for worker safety. Here, the women are working in a munitions plant, and they were given very little training. There were no safety procedures in place for them should an accident occur in the factory. So while they weren't serving overseas, women Teamsters were subject to dangerous work just the same as the men were. Here we see Teamsters working at a Mack military truck plant in Allentown. Teamsters also sell lots of Liberty bonds during the war to make sure support for that war is everywhere. Now, Black Teamsters joined the military and served with distinction despite low expectations from supervisors. The group here that are receiving medals are the Harlem Hellfighters, who were an extraordinary group of soldiers, whether they be Black or white. They were extremely outstanding in what they did, and received commendations for the military for their service. They went overseas with the Teamsters as well. They also, Black Teamsters, helped teach driving skills. They helped run supplies. And one of the other things that happened on the home front for Black Teamsters was they were allowed access to better jobs at home. They were allowed to have higher level delivery jobs. They were promoted to more responsibility. And this was highly unusual. Had it not been for the war, this probably would not have happened for these Teamster members, at least not as quickly as it did. Now, this does not mean that they had an easy time with this. There were a lot of people that were still determined to keep the old ways. Certainly in the military, segregation was the way of the day. Black soldiers were kept in their place, so to speak, but they were able to overcome those barriers. Big changes happen after the war in World War I, and much more so, I think, than later conflicts, because it's the first time that some of our members, both Black and white, are experiencing being away from home. Most Teamsters who are veterans of World War I had never been away from home. They may never have been outside of their town. If they were Teamsters from a large city like Chicago or New York or Los Angeles, they had some experience with a bigger city, Philadelphia, but they may not have ever been outside of Philly. So they didn't have a look at different cultures. Going over to Europe, seeing different lifestyles, having a freedom to make choices, particularly for African-American Teamsters, was unbelievable experience. Was it going to be enough to come home and go back to the way it was? The picture you see here on the left is a guy named Bill Lee. He's out of Chicago. He goes on to become a very prominent Teamster leader. But as a very young man, he is the first allowed to drive a motorized truck in 1917 for the bakery he works at. Then he goes overseas and serves in World War I. Is it going to be enough for him, after seeing what he sees in the war, to come home and drive a bakery truck again? This was a big question as these soldiers returned home. Was life going to be too different for them? Were they going to be able to settle in? All of those questions come about for the women as well. Women Teamsters went overseas with the Red Cross. Some went as nurses. They have their own eye-opening experiences. Those that stayed home and worked in the war effort, those jobs were important too. Were they going to be willing to give them up? And they were expected to give them up. They were expected to give their jobs up to returning soldiers and go back to being homebodies the way they had been. This is very different for them. Once you give someone a taste of freedom, a taste of independence, it's very hard to get them to go back inside the box. and many Teamster women just absolutely refused to do that. Here you see two groups of women after the war. One group here are mechanics. They stay in that area that they had trained in during the war. They don't give up those jobs. And on the other side, you see a woman who is a taxi driver in the 1920s because she did not want to go back to being a housewife. One of the things that happens with World War I that veterans didn't have to deal with on a wholesale basis the way they did after this conflict was something that is termed shell shock. After the war, because the kind of warfare that it was, most of the soldiers had never seen some of the atrocities that were seen in that conflict. This is modern war with modern warfare problems. The Civil War was a long time ago, and yeah, Gettysburg and some of those big battles, there were atrocities, but not mechanized atrocities like we see in World War I, where we have weapons that are so dangerous, so able to mass slaughter that men lose it. And this is something that is not understood. There is a genuine attempt to help those suffering from what is called shell shock, but they really don't understand what it is. They also believe that it will end quickly. Once you get home, you'll be fine. Americans are notorious for having this idea that you just need to pull yourself together, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And that doesn't help when they return either, because no one seems to understand what they are going through and what their families are going through. That's one of the things that I think we forget about in terms of talking about our veterans. It's not just the soldier, but it is also their family. And down here, you can see one of the things that they tried to do. Electricity was a very popular tool in the 1920s, used for all kinds of health reasons. And dealing with shell shock was one of the things that electricity was used for. They would hook up these patients to electric volts of power, hoping to jolt them out of whatever was happening. And it had very mixed success. It actually takes over 100 years and a number of wars for us to really understand the process of what we now refer to as post-traumatic stress syndrome to be understood. It goes through a series of changes with different wars, but the fact remains that soldiers see things that a normal human being shouldn't see, and it affects them. Whether it affects them on a large scale, like some of these men pictured here, or if it is internal distress that they deal with that they don't share, that was something that we had to deal with. Now, after the war is over, times are pretty good. We're expanding in the Teamsters. There are jobs. Wages are higher. So things are pretty good. Most veterans are getting jobs and settling in. That's true for Black veterans to a degree, but not enough. Yes, there are opportunities for our Black veterans as they come home, particularly in the Teamsters and other labor unions. But when they come home, after, and you can see here, I've got soldiers experience freedoms and dignity in Europe that they never had experienced before. And they seek to bring that home. They want that experience to be part of their life in America. They now know that a different way of life is possible, that they can live a lifestyle that they want or that they try to achieve. Because in Europe, Blacks are treated more equally. They want that to happen here. Unfortunately, what happens for our Black veterans is pretty dire. There is a lot of resentment to the fact that they are improving themselves and taking better jobs. With that, we see a rise in the Ku Klux Klan. We see riots occurring where citizens are not accepting of these Black soldiers coming back, and with their new attitude and new self-confidence in what they had experienced. They're forced to move out of their homes. They lose jobs, all because they have a new attitude. They have new expectations, and America is not ready to turn that page. And so these soldiers who served so well overseas and were brave and fought for freedom for others are not allowed to have it in America. Women who are veterans, whether they served overseas as nurses or Red Cross, or whether they were the war workers here, turn their energy to suffrage, because during the war, women still did not have the right to vote in any election. So after the war is over, they really push for that ability to vote, to have a say in what happens in the country. And Teamster women become very involved in the suffrage movement. They were involved before the war, but after the war, this takes on a new energy for them. Now, as we move through the 20s, we go into the 30s, we don't have any military conflicts going on, but we do have some conflicts going on that could be seen as wars. Teamsters are fighting different kinds of battles. They are fighting for recognition of the labor unions. They are fighting for recognition of their essential work that they do for the country. They are fighting for better wages, better lifestyles for their family, and they're fighting for safety for all Americans, whether it be food safety or safety on the job. Teamsters are striking to bring about changes. So it's not war service, but it is service to the country and those that participated in some of those major strikes, like the Minneapolis strike, indeed can be viewed as veterans of those different battles. Now, as the Depression starts to end, we move into World War II. World War II is interesting because for a long time, America does not join this conflict. We're sitting on tenterhooks, watching what is happening in Europe, but we don't take that final step to join the war effort until we are attacked by the Japanese on December 7th in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. When Pearl Harbor is attacked, Teamsters rush once again to defend their country. The picture on the right is Local 355, which is in Baltimore. The local went down together and registered for military service. Now, if you look at that picture, there are Black Teamsters and white Teamsters in that picture, and they are going down together as a unified force. But once they get in the military, of course, they are separated. Black and white Teamsters are put in separate units, and it only comes together on a couple of occasions, which I'll talk about in a second. But here we are, ready once again to serve. officers in the Union are very much being looked at by the military. They have discovered that Union officers, whether it be a principal officer or a business agent or even a steward, have certain skills that make for good officers in the military. They can handle crisis. They can handle all kinds of men. They can handle all kinds of situations. They can handle finances. They can handle thinking on their feet. These are all qualities that they want in military officers. So by the spotlight being on some of these labor leaders, this gives particularly guys who are stewards or business agents a shot at leadership that they never would have had in the civilian world. So they're able to propel themselves farther by doing service for the country than they would otherwise. Here, down here, you see also 4 Wisconsin Teamsters join the Marine Corps. Teamsters on the home front are serving in a wide variety of capacities. Teamsters bought more than $2 million worth of war bonds by 1943. Now you need to think about that in terms of 1943 dollars. That is a lot of money that Teamsters spend to support the war. In fact, we offer the government $8 million interest-free loan for the war effort, which they politely declined. I don't think they wanted to owe the Teamsters anything. Teamsters promote bond sales by having advertisements on their trucks. A lot of Teamsters on the home front are civil defense wardens, making sure that everything is okay at home. We are very much involved in scrap drives, metal drives, raising collections for soldiers. Here, local 970 collects sporting equipment to send over to the soldiers so that they have something to do in their what little free time they had. And I put down here and cigarettes because Teamsters were well known for sending soldiers cigarettes. And we did that in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The one thing the military could always count on from the Teamsters was cigarettes, because that was, everybody smoked. And so that was the best gift that you could give soldiers at that time. Obviously, today, we would not consider doing that, but that was our big goal, to make sure every soldier had a pack of smokes. Now, Dan Tobin during the war is actually asked by Franklin Roosevelt to travel overseas, much like he did in World War I, but even more extensively in World War II. Tobin spends a good portion of the war overseas or working on war production, helping handle labor issues for the country during the war. He does a number of radio addresses, which were very popular, talking about the necessities of patriotism on the home front and keeping war production going and keeping supplies going to soldiers overseas. One of the things that the Teamsters do as a union, which other unions then copied, was we declare that there will be no strikes for the duration, meaning we will not strike any company, in particular companies that are in war production service, until the conflict is over, and we don't. Teamster women answer the call, again, same as World War I. They jump in and they serve in many capacities. These women, again, are working at a munitions factory. We got bakery drivers over here. Now, this was not to say that they did not have their tribulations. The picture at the bottom is a woman showing off what was called a safety bra. There is always this concern with women workers about what they're wearing and how revealing it is, and will men be able to work if they can see a woman's shape while they're working. And the safety bra came about because men decided that women might get their parts caught in machinery. Now, to any ladies out there in the audience, I don't know about you, but I never worried about getting my parts caught in anything. And these bras were very heavy, very uncomfortable. And they came actually to the Teamsters to help get that take that rule taken away, so that they would not have to wear these garments on the job. For a long time, women also were required to wear skirts or dresses to work, even if they were on a production line, because the view was that pants were too revealing, and that men would not be able to concentrate on their job if they could see women's butts outlined in pants. The Teamsters also helped get that changed. So those were just some of the crazy things that were going on. Teamsters are very, very involved in the military effort in World War II. In 1941, 1,700 Teamsters helped build the Burma Road, which is the main supply line in the China-Burma-India theater. You can see the aerial view of the road that they built. And here trucks are crossing a bridge to bring supplies to the front in the Pacific in 1944. This is a crucial bit of supply route for the war effort. And as I said, it was the Teamsters that did it. We also built the Alaska Highway as a defense system for that northern territory that we have. That one was interesting because it was largely built by women Teamsters. In Europe, the Red Ball Express becomes the main supply route through northwestern France. It is built and serviced by the Army's Quartermaster General and Truck Corps, most of whom were Teamsters. They deliver and make sure tons of supplies. You can see there 412,000 tons of supplies are run through that route. There's actually a movie that was done about the Red Ball Express and how key it was. And Patton takes the Red Ball Express. But they don't mention in the movie that it's the Teamsters that build it and run it. That's not mentioned at all. And what they really don't mention is that most of the Red Ball Express truck drivers were Black Teamsters. And they were on this front line, making sure service was provided to all the other soldiers from D-Day forward without a break. And nobody talks about that at all. 3 Teamsters were honored with the Congressional Medal of Honor during World War II. Charles Kelly out of Local 249 in Pittsburgh, Raymond Zussman out of Local 337 in Detroit, and John Basilone out of 469 in New Jersey. All 3 of these men showed extraordinary valor and heroism during actions in World War II. There is, some of you may have seen, Ken Burns did a documentary series on the war, which is very good, talking about World War II from the perspective of 4 different towns in America. A later piece is done by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg on the Pacific. And one of the stories that is told in the Pacific, and you can get these off of Netflix or Amazon Prime, they talk a lot about John Basilone and how he became a Medal of Honor winner and how that affects him. But what I find interesting is that they don't mention his union service at all. And he was a very active union member, but that does not come up at all. Here is just a picture of those Medal of Honor for the different branches of service. If you're ever anywhere and you see a veteran with this blue star ribbon around their neck, that tells you that that is a Congressional Medal of Honor winner, and you should go up and congratulate them for their service. Here, I just listed a few of the various regiments that Teamsters served in during World War II. There's some there and a few more here, including the quartermaster truck companies. The Teamsters actually really created the Quartermaster General Truck Corps. Their headquarters are in Virginia, and I have been trying, so far unsuccessfully, to get them to put a plaque honoring the Teamsters at that site, because we were actually the ones beginning in World War I who began to formulate that motor truck company. Now, I want to talk for just a minute about another Band of Brothers. Band of Brothers was a TV docudrama, I guess they're called, about Easy Company of the 101st Airborne in World War II and the exploits that this company did during World War II. Extraordinary things that this company did. But what I want to point out to you is that there was another band of brothers that were equally important during that conflict. They were the 3807th Truck Corps in the Quartermaster General Truck Company. They were on the ground and working for the soldiers of Easy Company from D-Day until Berlin fell. The guys in this other band of brothers, if you've seen the documentary Band of Brothers, when the paratroopers in Easy Company land on D-Day, they miss the mark, they're separated, they don't know where they are, they're missing their supplies. And you see a scene in the documentary where suddenly this truck comes out of nowhere and has supplies for them and helps them get everything together. That was the 3807 that did that. Later in the docudrama, they're in Bastogne and it's snowing and they are freezing. They don't have any supplies. Food is very low. They're running out of ammunition. They don't know what's going to happen. And again, there's a scene, lights coming out of the dark, a truck coming in with supplies for them at the 11th hour. And that is the 3807th, yet again coming in to save the members of Easy Company. Nobody talks about these guys. And they were on the front line giving just as much service to their country as the paratroopers or other infantrymen might have done. The picture in the center is the surviving members of 3807 who, it's been a few years now, I had the distinct pleasure of meeting the 10 survivors and having dinner with them and listening to their stories of not only their service in the war, but their life as Teamsters after the war, and how important they saw the Teamsters being to that service to the country, and that they were proud not only to be a veteran of their country's military, but they were proud to be a veteran Teamster because they didn't see a lot of difference. Both were serving the country and trying to raise the citizens up. Another World War II veteran was John Cleveland, who becomes the first Black international vice president. He was a mess sergeant in the Army during World War II. After the war is over, he is working at Safeway. He is the first Black allowed to train as a baker in the Safeway company. Previous to that, they were unsure if customers would buy goods that were handled by a Black baker, which is, to me, crazy because people had cooks and everything else who had been Black for years. Why that sentiment went on to store-bought cakes, I don't understand. But he also ran into a lot of prejudice because he was a rising leader in the union and becomes the head of local union 730. And there is a lot of discontent among the community to see a Black leader rise the way he does in the union. Now, during the war, the Teamsters tried to help Blacks at home be able to move up and get better jobs, higher paying jobs, jobs with more responsibility. But the question was, could that be maintained after the war was over? Would they be allowed to keep those jobs that they had worked so hard to achieve? Teamsters during the war used their skills in a variety of ways. If there were no horses or there were no trucks, you drove whatever was at hand. And here you can see they're driving with camels. Teamster magazine picks up on Teamster service during World War II and does a number of articles about Teamsters on the ground overseas. In the first article here, Ralph Frost is injured badly, but refuses to be sent home, overcomes his injuries, and goes back into war service. Here we've got two Teamster members meeting up as friends on Peleliu Island during the Pacific Theater War. And if anyone knows the history of World War II, Peleliu was a terrible battle, lots of casualties, and they kind of just brush it off like, oh, they're having a day at the park. It was not a day at the park. The Teamster magazine did what was called Chaff of Battle, where they listed those who had been killed, those that were missing, those that were injured in battle, so the folks at home could keep up with who was where and what was happening to their fellow members. Patton praises the Teamsters, thinks the truck drivers are the best he's ever seen. The World War II monument in Washington, D.C. During World War II, about 125,000 Teamsters served, about 3,500 become casualties of that conflict. Now, after World War II, like World War I, we have the effects of battle. Now referred to as battle fatigue, many veterans experience this in one way or another. A large number of veterans of World War II did not talk about their experiences in the war for decades. One support that these veterans had that maybe veterans in later conflicts did not was that most of their generation fought in the war. So when they needed to have somebody around them that understood what they were going through, they could rely on coworkers or friends to understand what was happening with them. Also, the U.S. had won the war. We are seen as a positive, growing nation. And the view of the veterans is very positive. They're victors. And that adds a different twist to how the GIs are treated when they come home, as opposed to, say, the Vietnam veterans when they came home. But they still are supposed to just get on with it. And one of the things that you notice that happens after World War II, as the young men are moving into the workforce and starting families and whatnot, what becomes common staple for that generation is the cocktail hour. They drink a lot of alcohol very casually. Part of that goes back to that dealing with that service in the war. You're not going to talk about it. You're not going to deal with it. You're going to move on, but you need to have some way to help you smooth out the rough edges. And that's what they turn to. After World War II, like earlier wars, Black veterans had proved themselves, but segregation is still a problem. And in fact, it is worse maybe now than it had been at home, because Blacks, again, are moving up, are becoming more educated, and the public doesn't like that. Dave Brubeck, who is a white jazz musician, had organized and played with a desegregated military band during the war. And he was horrified when things returned to normal with separate facilities and separate lives for Blacks and whites. Decades later, he is interviewed for that docuseries, The War, and he becomes very emotional, very angry and choked up when talking about it, because he says, we fought for freedom. We fought to liberate people. And yet when we come home, we're separated again. And it just rankled so badly with him that still after decades, he had not gotten over it. And one of his more famous pieces is called It's About Time. And that explores those issues of race relations and how they are portrayed in American culture. Things changed for women after the war, too. They were encouraged to give up their jobs to the veterans. They were encouraged to return to traditional role as homemakers. Even the coverage in the magazine goes back to kind of the little woman idea. During the war, there are all kinds of features on women being independent and doing things for the war effort. After the war is over, they are boiled down to one page, and it's called Listen, Ladies. And there's recipes in there. There's ways to get ink out of your tablecloth, all kinds of different things like that are shown, but nothing about them being leaders or being independent. Now, that's not just the Teamsters, of course. That is a national trend. Everybody wants June Cleaver to reappear after the war is over. Everybody wants to forget that we had all those years of conflict. And here, this is a statement from a Teamster woman who fought or who worked during World War II, fought in her own way, I guess. And she says, you know, my mother warned me that if I took a job, I'd never be the same. And she talks about why I didn't believe her. And then she realizes she had this independence that she never had experienced before, and that there was no way that she could ever go back to being the same girl that she had been before the war was over. And I would say that that was true for Black Teamster veterans as well. They could not go back to being that boy, all right? These were men now who had come home, and they expected to be treated as such. Finally, the United States desegregates the military in 1948. Here you can see headlines, New York Times. But here in this paper, you see they talk about the desegregation of the military, but what is the article right below it? A posse talking about lynching because they are unhappy with what is going on. So the president may have made it official, but there was still a very long way to go for veterans to be able to experience the equality. The GI Bill comes out after World War II and allows for educational and housing opportunities for all veterans. And that obviously includes Black veterans. Now, there were some pushbacks on Blacks for using the GI Bill, but most overcame those, pushed forward, and were able to make amazing strides, both in education and in status in the community. But it was a tough push for them. But the GI Bill for many American soldiers was a real break. A lot of working class families now had the opportunity to move into different circles, to become more educated, to take higher paying, higher status jobs, because for the first time ever, they are able to afford to go to college. They are able to afford to buy their own home. And these are extraordinary changes that happen. And today, we don't think about how that changed life so immediately in the country for a whole class of workers, but it did. Now, Teamsters returning home were the only veterans that were guaranteed their seniority when they returned home. Later, other unions followed, but it begins with Teamsters. Now, the Teamsters are starting a program called Have It Delivered, which is designed to create jobs for returning veterans and expands the membership base. Teamsters continue to serve the Korean War. Teamsters are first on the spot with the truck corps, moving equipment and helping soldiers in the Korean War. Again, we serve in every capacity in what was later known as the Forgotten War. People forget how much we were involved in that whole effort, and that it was in many cases as deadly as World War II, just on a smaller scale. And people did not want to think about another war. This was termed a police action. It was the way of sort of lowering the expectations on that conflict. As we move into Vietnam, things change a little bit in that it's now sons of Teamster members who are serving. There is the lottery, conscription is less, and a whole generation is not fighting in this war. But Teamsters are very traditional, very patriotic, and are very expectant of their sons to serve in the military the same as they did. So when you look at the makeup of the Vietnam soldiers, they are disproportionately working class, and a lot of those are minorities as well. But here you can see the Teamsters celebrate those sons of members members who are overseas serving during that Vietnam conflict. Again, another son of a Teamster, and the dad also had served in World War II. Here are some of those awards that those Teamsters in the later conflicts received. Again, more of our Teamsters serving in Vietnam. Now, Teamsters are still very involved with our veterans. We have veterans groups in various locals. Local 1150 is certainly one of the biggest of the veterans groups. We honor our veterans every Veterans Day. Here at the bottom, you see Local 177 hoisting the POW flag at the Teamster headquarters. So we do certainly keep in mind how all of our members have served, whether it was the home front, whether it was active military duty, being held as a POW, or killed in action. We are not celebrating, but honoring those exploits. Here we have Local 63 sending supplies to Iraq. Teamsters have always been one to send necessary items, care packages to our soldiers, no matter what the conflict was, or even if there was not a conflict, we still send goods to our serving soldiers. We also are involved in several programs. One is called Helmets to Hard Hats. This is a program that was designed to help those leaving the military train for jobs in the construction industry. That program has been going on for a couple of decades. But I just spoke with Gary LaBarbera Jr., who is out of Local 282 in New York. And we're really trying to re-ramp up this program and get Teamsters all across the country to be more supportive of this program, get involved with it, because it kind of dwindled down, as it does over time, and we want to reinvigorate it. So if you have interest in becoming involved with veterans issues, this is one way that you can do it. We also have the Teamsters Military Assistance Program. This is a program, again, working with folks leaving the military and helping them prepare for jobs outside of the military. And a lot of that particular program has to do with truck driving and getting your CDL and being involved with that industry. ABF Freight is one of the big supporters of that program. And here are some of the Teamster members who are now part of that military training program. Another thing that happened with the Teamsters, particularly after 9/11, was the First Observer program. And that was designed to train truck drivers to be aware of suspicious activity, to be aware of things that don't seem quite right while they are delivering goods across the country on the highway or in the shipping ports. It was just another way for the Teamsters to serve the country and participate by sharing their knowledge and their insights of what they see going on around the country. The Warrior Games. The Warrior Games are an important activity for veterans of all stripes, but in particular, wounded warriors. The Teamsters are sponsors of and volunteers at, as well as Patriot Guard members of the Warrior Games. This is an event that if you get a chance to go to, I would say it's well worth your time. It is Olympic-style games for wounded veterans participating in a wide variety of activities in competition, and other veterans attend. And as I said, Teamster veterans serve as Patriotic Guard members for those athletes, helping them transfer in and out of vehicles or getting whatever they need. The Teamsters are there to help them do that. So like I said, it's a very moving experience. I was at the 2017 games and never experienced anything like it. So I would highly recommend it. Sort of in summing up, when we talk about remembering our veterans, I want you to keep some things in mind. First of all, over the last 120 years, our members have served this country well, regardless of whether the country returned the favor or not. These are young men who went in and came out as old souls. They had seen things and done things that changed them forever. And that's something that we need to remember, that their story goes much deeper than just a guy who's wearing ribbons on his chest or in a military parade. It's our duty to take up that slack where the country dropped the ball and give them the respect that they deserve. Often coming back, particularly in later conflicts, I think particularly about Vietnam, there was no brass band, there was no welcome home, there was no helping hand for these veterans. Part of it was because we didn't want to think about that war. It tore the country apart. The country was divided on its sentiment about that war. The war dragged on for over 10 years. And we did not return as victors. And so therefore, those returning veterans were pushed aside. And now is time for us to change that history. We need to make it a point to have events that include our veterans, to sponsor soldiers, whether they are active or now veterans. Invite vets to speak about their experiences, to speak about why military service was important to them and how that relates to their experience as a Teamster. Find out how the union helped and can help now for veterans and those currently in service. And remember, it's not just the soldier who might be affected. How can we help our military families? What do they need from us as their larger Teamster family? And again, I ask that you support Helmets to Hard Hats, support TMAP, support the Warrior Games. That is how we are going to make a difference for those who did go in as those bright-eyed young people and came out looking weary beyond their years. And I just wanted to put a few pictures of some of our veterans. Bob Morales has left us, but he was the head of Local 350, and he carried patriotism and service to the nation in every inch of his body and served the Teamsters well for decades with that same spirit that he had as a young man in military service. At the top there, you've got what I call yet a third band of brothers who are Teamster bus drivers in Central Illinois. They were all in the Marine Corps, and the comment from one of them up there, we look out and care for each other the same as we did in the Marines. The veterans as Teamsters, we are ingrained with that sense of duty to the nation. And that is very true of a lot of our veterans. This picture up at the top is very poignant, I think. And that is when you see those old warriors, don't blow them off. They still are seeing themselves as a young man, as we all do. I look in the mirror now and think, what the hell? How did I become my mother? So, you know, these guys are doing the same thing. And remember, they may be a bent over old man now, but they were strong badass people during the war years, and she served as well. Whether she served as a Rosie the Riveter or whether she served in military service, she needs actual equal recognition. And sometimes the veterans are people that you may not even know, and she may kill me for doing this, but some of you may know and have talked to Edwina Easter. She is one of our travel agents in the Teamsters travel department, and many people don't know that she served quite a long service in the U.S. Army. So I put her picture up there, and she'll probably kill me, but that's okay. We have been doing our part here at the Teamsters for more than 100 years, and I do hope that we will continue to do that. So that is my presentation. So I want to see if anybody has any comments, questions. I know I covered a lot of stuff. I wanted to try to hit on not only what we did, but what our veterans experienced as well. So comments, questions.
Hi, Karin. Ken Hall from Teamsters Local 230 here in Canada. That was an excellent presentation, and thanks for all the work that you do, bringing the history to light for all of us to enjoy and understand. Thank you.
You know, I just realized, Ken, that the slides that I prepared on Teamster Canada veterans, I didn't stick in. So at some point, we'll do one on Canadian veterans.
That was fine. It was an excellent presentation. Thank you for all you do, Karin.
Other thoughts, comments? Come on.
Very good.
Hi.
But also we have to remember that even in World War II, the military segregated. And if we go back into 1919, there's actually a national backlash against blacks that were returning.
Yes.
Burned down places, all in Chicago, different places like that.
Riots everywhere. Yeah.
That's why the Union cannot remain silent when it sees certain things.
Absolutely.
Hey, good morning,
Yeah,
Professor Arneson.
That was terrific. And I very much appreciated your inclusion of a considerable amount of material on the experience of African-American soldiers in World War I and World War II. I just finished last night, somewhere around 11:30, the last episode 10 of Band of Brothers that's now streaming on Netflix. So got through my 10 episodes. And reflecting the segregation in the armed forces, there was barely a black face to be seen. This was an all-white unit that's being explored in the series. But what's also struck me after hearing your talk and seeing the very end of the series, when they reflect on what people go on to do, later in life, sort of the absolute kind of erasure of, I don't want to say the labor dimension, but the union dimension that you've talked about. So I don't know the specific backgrounds of the individuals that I just viewed, but there's I'm imagining from this and other things I've seen, there's almost no recognition that people come out of union backgrounds at all. So I think what you're doing is very important. I wish there was a lot more attention to this, and the history, I think, is incomplete when the union dimension is just kind of airbrushed out, or not even, it doesn't even occur to the filmmakers that this is a part of the story. So thank you.
Well, that's what I found so interesting in the Band of Brothers. Now, obviously, they're focusing on Easy Company.
Yes.
But they could have done a segment a little bit on that Band of Brothers, which, by the way, the 3807 had 2 black members in it. They were no longer alive, but they weren't part of the 10 that I had dinner with. But they could have shown a little bit about them, and all of those men were from a labor background, and all of those men returned to labor once the war was over. And nobody talks about how they took those skills that they gained in the war, those leadership skills, those crisis skills, and took that back to the shop floor.
Yeah.
That's not explored at all. And that's especially true for African Americans, because they were able to gain some leadership and whatnot, much to the dismay of the US government, but they did anyway. And they were able to translate that maybe in smaller sections, but were able to move up extraordinarily well in some circles because of that experience that they had, that otherwise they would not have been able to do. Because one thing that people did appreciate was military service after the war. And so if a Black man was a veteran, that gave him a little bit of an edge in some circles that he might not have had otherwise. But it still, was a horribly tough road.
Just one more quick point. At the time of the start of World War World War II and conscription, Ernest Calloway, who later becomes a very important Teamster organizer and official, is working for the International Brotherhood of Redcaps. And he refuses to register for the draft and to be inducted into the military on the grounds that I will not serve in a Jim Crow army. And he wages this small scale campaign. In the end, he's not called up. It's like, we want this guy to go away. This is bad publicity. So he gets away with it. But this is headline news in some African American newspapers, in some left-wing newspapers. So it's a thread that you might want to pull at some point in the future. This is his pre-Teamster days, but still, it's a stance that is quite principled, and he's right. It is a Jim Crow military, and what African American soldiers are subjected to is nothing short of a horror, or what some activists later call, the war's greatest scandal.
Yeah. I agree. I did not know that about Ernest. I've always found him a fascinating figure and knew he did a lot of things, but I did not know that. So I'll send you some stuff. We'll have to include that in.
Karin, you talked about the Red Ball Express and the amount of tonnage that they had moved in this very tight space of time. I think it's still a record today to move that much tonnage in that space of time. It's a record that still stands.
I think that you're probably right. They were extraordinary folks that did that. And it always makes me mad when I think of that movie and that they don't mention the labor aspect. And of course, they show all of the men as white in the movie, when in fact, most of them were not white.
Yeah, I mean, even look at the pilots from the Tuskegee Airmen.
Yep.
None of them were ever hired by an airlines to become a pilot in spite of their exemplary service during World War II. It's history.
Yep. Well, and I think another group that is interesting, and it plays to some of our West Coast Teamsters and our Hawaiian Teamsters, and that is the internment of Japanese during World War II, but yet later in the war, they were allowed to serve in select units and did quite well. That's just another example of the U.S. government being, short-sighted, paranoid about citizens. They weren't even immigrants. These were citizens, and a number of them were Teamsters who worked on the West Coast. I know I've talked to the grandchildren of some of our members who were interned during the war. Other thoughts?
Yes, it's Anthony. I'd just like to say, Karen, you always do such a well job. It was excellent, a lot of knowledge, and I always thank men and women when I see them. If they're in uniform or if they're not in uniform, just thanking them for their service and our freedom, which people don't take time to think about. Because of them fighting, we're free. And also to keep in mind that, Teamster contracts have language in there that states, to give them their seniority
Yep.
when they come back.
Yep.
So I want to thank you again.
Well,
Excellent job.
couple things that I would want to point out. First, I agree, thanking people for their service and whatnot. And something I've done a couple of times is I always feel like, I can go up and thank them, and that's great. But a couple of times I have at the airport seen soldiers traveling, and I'll buy their meal. And that's just for me, a way to say, hey, I'm not just mouthing a sentiment to you. I actually appreciate what you do. So, that's something you might think about if you're in the airport or something and you see a couple of soldiers eating dinner. Tell the waitress you're going to pick up their tab. Now, the other thing that I wanted to ask, we've got some ladies on here. What did you think about the women's experience? I'd like to hear some of your comments. Jackie, you've got to have something to say. Nope, she's not going to comment.
Karin,
Yes.
this is Nicole. I've seen your history for women at our women's conferences every year. And so seeing that and seeing this, it does give me that honor to be a Teamster as a female, because we have been, even though it might be behind the scenes, we've always been a part of it, and we've always tried to take our place at the table.
Yeah.
And you encouraging our future generations, because I'm already on more of a veteran side, being an older Teamster, you've encouraged the women to step up and fight for a lot of different things, the injustice, fight for a seat at the table, fight for the American public. And so I want to say that thank you for bringing these little pieces together in all the different aspects, and for continuing to educate us. And they do speak volumes. So thank you again.
You're welcome. And, to me, it's allowing the women to speak for themselves, allowing those stories to come forth and to inspire our younger women, because the stories themselves are inspiring. Well, it doesn't look like we have other comments. Is there a question in the chat? Okay, it doesn't. Okay, well, if nobody has any comments left, then I guess we can call it a day. What do we think?
Thank you, Karin. Appreciate you.
Thank you, guys. Now I want to put a bug in your ear before you all leave. We've got an amazing program coming up in December with our very own Eric Arneson, and he is going to delve into more of African American history during World War II. And as always, his programs are fantastic. So please watch for the flyers that come out on that program, because I think you'll really enjoy that one as well. With that, I will say goodbye to y'all. Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Stay safe, y'all.
Thank you, Karin.
You're welcome.